Her husband's family branded her cheek and drove her out with the cattle dogs. The first thing I noticed was the dogs. 3 of them working the edge of my south pasture, brindle heelers, and they weren't mine. I set down the post I was carrying and watched them quarter the grass for a minute before I understood they were driving something ahead of them. Not cattle, something that moved on 2 legs and kept stopping to turn and face them before moving again. I didn't run. I walked. That's just how I'm built. I was 40 years old before I ever ran anywhere that wasn't on fire, and I wasn't starting at 62. I crossed the fence line at the low spot near the creek and came up through the willows, and by the time the dogs heard me and scattered, it was already too late for me to unsee what they'd been running. She was sitting in the creek, not bathing, sitting in it with her boots on, the water maybe 6 inches deep there, cold enough in October to ache. She was holding her right arm across her ribs, and I couldn't tell if it was broken or just bruised, and her face was turned away from me, turned toward the far bank, and she didn't move when I stopped at the edge of the water. I said, "Those your dogs?" She said they were. I waited. She said, "They'll go back if I don't." I looked at the direction the healers had run, east, back toward the Creel property line about 4 miles off. The Creels ran 800 head and a crew of 12, and a reputation I'd been carefully not touching for 11 years. Martin Creel and his 2 brothers had come out from Missouri in the 60s, and by 74 they'd shoved most of the small ranchers off the valley grass through legal means, and a few means that weren't. My place was still mine, because I was far enough north that their water didn't reach me, and because I'd never given them a reason and never borrowed from their bank. I said, "You come from the Creel operation." She turned then. I'll tell you straight, I was ready for something bad, and I still wasn't ready. The left side of her face was fine, handsome even, a woman maybe 35, dark-haired, some wind and sun to her. The right side had a scar shaped like a C, about 2 inches across, sitting just below her cheekbone, old enough that it had settled into the skin, healed but not by a doctor. I've seen a brand. I grew up on cattle. I know what a running iron does to flesh and how long it takes to scar over like that, and I stood there in the willows with the cold creek sound around us, and I felt something drop in my chest like a stone going into deep water. She watched me look at it. She didn't turn away again. She'd been through whatever you go through when you stop turning away. I said, "Can you walk?" She said, "Yes." "Then come up to the house and get warm, and we'll figure out the rest." She looked at me for a moment, not suspicious, not hopeful, just measuring. Like a person who has learned to read men fast, because slow reading costs too much. She stood up out of the creek. The arm across her ribs stayed there. I didn't offer a hand, and she didn't ask for one. Her name was Delia Voss. Delia Creel now, legally, though that was a name she said like she was carrying something dead in her mouth. She'd married the youngest Creel boy, Thomas, 3 years back. He'd been the one who wasn't like the brothers, she said. The one who'd come into the dry goods and talked to her like a person. She'd been teaching at the Millhaven school. Her own people were gone, a father dead of a burst appendix, a mother back in Ohio who she hadn't seen in 6 years. Thomas died of a fever 14 months into the marriage, June of last year. I didn't ask what happened after. She told me while I made coffee, and she held the cup in both hands to warm them. She didn't tell it like a story. She told it the way you tell something you've gone over so many times it doesn't have any texture left. The brothers decided the land Thomas had been deeded as his share of the operation reverted to the family. There was a paper, or there was claimed to be a paper. She had a piece of their land in her name from Thomas, 40 acres at the North Cut. Not much, but water rights attached, and they wanted that too. She said no. She said no twice. The third time they asked, Harlan Creel, the eldest, did what he'd apparently done to at least one other person she'd heard about but couldn't prove. He used a running iron. He told her it meant she was Creel property same as the heifers, and she could either understand that and stay and be useful, or understand that and leave and never come back. She left. That was 4 months ago. She'd been working a kitchen in Millhaven for a man named Doer who paid less than he should have and asked for more than he was owed. And when she'd finally walked out of Doer's 3 days ago, she'd started walking and hadn't stopped with a plan in mind, just the direction of a way. I poured more coffee. The stove was throwing good heat. Outside the window the light was going orange over the North Ridge and the dogs were long gone. I said, "The 40 acres with the water rights. You have the deed." She looked at me. "I have it." "Where?" She reached inside her coat, she'd kept it on, still cold to the bone, and from an inside pocket she brought out a folded square of paper wrapped in oilcloth. She set it on the table between us. I didn't touch it, I just looked at it. I said, "That deed's good. Harlan Creel knows it's good, which is why he didn't just take it." She said, "He said no court in the valley would honor it." I said, "He's probably right about the valley." She waited. I said, "County seat's different. Judge Alderman doesn't owe the Creels anything because he's from the east side of the state and he's only been here 2 years, and he's the kind of man who enjoys telling cattlemen what they can't do." I picked up my coffee. "I've met him twice. I think he'd enjoy this particular piece of paper." Delia Voss sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Why would you do anything with this? You don't know me." I thought about how to answer that and decided not to make it complicated. I said, "Because Harlan Creel did that to your face and figures, he can do anything he wants in this valley, and he's not wrong about that yet. And I've been letting him not be wrong for 11 years, and I'm getting a little tired of it." That was true. It was also incomplete, but it was enough for the moment. She stayed in my spare room that night and the next night, and then it became the room where her coat hung on the hook behind the door, and her few things sat on the washstand, and neither of us made a ceremony about it. I want to be clear about what it was in those first weeks. It was work. I had 2 hired men, Cass and an older fellow named Prout who had a bad knee and was good with horses and not much else, and the 3 of us had more than we could cover with winter coming. Delia started in the kitchen and then drifted out to the barn, and I found out she'd grown up on a farm in Ohio and knew which end of a horse was which. And more than that, and after a week I stopped thinking of her as a guest. She was quiet the way useful people are quiet. She didn't fill silence because she was nervous. She filled it when she had something to say and let it be when she didn't. I'm not much of a talker and I've never lived well with someone who is, so that was a thing. The arm that had been across her ribs healed up. A cracked rib, I figured, probably a boot. She never said. She wore her hair so it covered the right side of her face when she was in town, which wasn't often. The few times I took her to Millhaven for supplies, I watched people see the scar and look away, and I watched her watch them do it with a face that had learned to give away nothing. Once, in the feed store, a woman named Guthrie who talked too much said something about it being a shame about that girl's face, said it to her husband in a voice that was meant to be private and wasn't. I was on the other side of a shelf of tack. I came around the corner and looked at Mrs. Guthrie until she found something else to look at, and I picked up the bag of seed I'd come for and we left. Delia didn't say anything until we were out of town and on the road, and then she said, "You didn't have to do that." I said no. She looked at me sideways. I said, "But I did it anyway." She turned back to the road, and after a moment the corners of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but almost. Harlan Creel came to the ranch on a Tuesday, first week of November. I saw the dust from the south road before I saw the rider, and I put Cass on the roof of the barn with a rifle and told Prout to take the horses in and stay in the barn, and I waited in the yard. He came alone, which surprised me. He was a big man, Harlan, not tall but wide, 48 or so, gray in his beard, the kind of man who has never had to wonder whether a room would listen when he spoke. He rode into the yard and stopped and looked at the house, and then at me. He said, "I hear you've got something that belongs to the Creel family." I said, I've got a hired woman who keeps good books and cooks better than I do. If she was Creole property before, I wouldn't know it. I don't buy branded cattle. He looked at me for a long time. He was used to that working. I let him look. He said, "You're Ren Ballard." I said, "I am." He said, "I've heard you're not a stupid man." I said, "I've heard the same about you, and I'm keeping an open mind." Something moved across his face. "She's got a piece of paper that says she owns 40 acres that's been Creole land for 8 years. That paper's fraudulent. Judge Alderman will have a view on that." The name landed. I saw it land. Harlan Creel's jaw didn't move, but something behind his eyes recalculated. He said, "You stay out of Creole business, Ballard. You're a long way north of your pasture getting into this." I said, "I filed a complaint with the county sheriff at Fort Canby last Thursday about the unlawful branding of a woman on what was then Creole property. I also filed the deed for the 40 acres with the county recorder at the same time. The recorder's office notified Judge Alderman as a courtesy because the deed involves a water right that's been in dispute. I did all of that before you came here, so if you've come here to threaten me into undoing it, you're about 4 days late." I watched him understand that. He said, "You'll regret this." I said, "Probably. But you'll regret it first." He sat on his horse for another moment, and then he turned and rode back south the way he came, and I watched him until the dust was gone, and then I stood in the yard another minute just listening to the wind in the grass, because I hadn't been sure how that would go, and I was glad it had gone the way it had. When I turned around, Delia was standing in the door of the house. I don't know how long she'd been there, long enough by her face. I walked to the porch and went up the steps, and she didn't move out of the doorway, so I stopped about a foot from her. She was looking at me the way she'd looked at me in the creek that first day measuring, but it was different now. Less reading for danger. More reading for something else that I couldn't name and didn't try. She said, "You filed that complaint before he ever came here?" I said, "Yes." "Before you knew if he would?" "I knew he would." She said, very quiet, "Nobody has done anything like that for me." I didn't have anything useful to say to that, so I didn't say it. I held her eye, and after a moment she reached out and took hold of my forearm with both her hands, not grabbing, just holding, the way you hold something you want to make sure is real. Her hands were cold from standing in the doorway. I could feel the grip of her fingers through my sleeve. We stood like that for a bit, and then she let go and went inside, and I went in after her. The county process took until March. I won't try to make it a tidy story because it wasn't. There was a week in December when 3 Creole men cut my south fence and ran 40 head of my cattle into a canyon 6 miles east, and I lost 2 to the cold before Cass, and I got them back. There was a night in January when somebody put a torch to my hay shed, and we saved the barn but lost the shed, and about a third of my winter feed. I had to buy hay at a price that made me wince from a man in Millhaven, who knew I had no other option. Through all of it, Delia kept the books and kept the horses, and one January morning when I came in from the burned shed with my coat smelling like smoke and my hands black with it, she poured water into a basin without being asked and brought it to the table and set it in front of me, and I washed my hands and she dried them with a cloth, and I looked at her, and she looked at me, and for the first time in a long time, longer than I'd thought about, maybe since my wife Alina passed 12 years back, I felt like I wasn't carrying the whole weight of everything alone. I didn't say that. I'm not made for saying things like that, but I think she knew. Cass knew. Cass was 26 and had opinions about everything and the particular talent of sharing them at wrong moments. One afternoon he said to me from behind a fence post, "She's not going anywhere, you know." I said, "Get back to work." He drove a staple. "I'm just saying." "Cass." "Yes, sir." He got back to work, but he was grinning. Judge Alderman ruled in Delia's favor on the deed in the first week of March. The 40 acres was hers, water rights attached. Harlan Creel paid a fine for the branding, less than I thought he should, more than aldermen could get a conviction on, and the fine was a number that meant something to a man even as rich as Harlan. The valley didn't love us for it. Some of the smaller ranchers were glad. The Creels had sat on most of them at one time or another, but nobody was going to say so publicly. A few people who'd been friendly enough before the winter got quiet. A merchant in Millhaven I'd done business with for 9 years found reasons not to have what I needed. None of it was unexpected. I was 62 years old and I'd been in this valley for over 30 years, and I'd watched what happened to men who made enemies of the wrong families. I knew what I'd bought. Delia asked me once, near the end of February, if I was sorry I'd started it. I thought about it, genuinely thought about it, because she deserved a real answer. I said no. She said they're not finished. I said no, but neither am I. She was quiet for a while, then she said, I want to sell the 40 acres. I looked at her. She said, I want to sell it to you. For what it's worth by county assessment, which alderman set at $420. I've thought about it, and that's what I want. I said, why? She said, because then you have the water right, and the Creels can never use the deed to get back at you for helping me. You're tied to it now. If you have the deed and the water right, you have a reason that's purely yours, that doesn't need me in it. I said, I don't need a reason that doesn't need you in it. She looked at me. I said, I mean that plainly. She held my eye for a long moment, long enough that the light through the west window moved a little. She said, all right. We didn't shake hands. I'm not sure exactly what we did. She turned back to the stove, and I stood in the kitchen another moment, and the fire popped in the firebox, and outside the wind was coming down off the north ridge the way it does in late winter, steady and cold and clean. Spring came late, but it came. I've been asked since, by men who knew the rough outline of the story, whether I thought I was a hero for what I did. Most of them asked it the way men ask things they already have an opinion about. I wasn't a hero. I was a man who was tired of looking the other way, and there was a woman in front of me who had been wronged badly and was standing up straight about it, and I had the standing and the resources to do something, and I did it. That's all. That's the whole of it. What I wasn't expecting was the rest. I wasn't expecting that she'd still be there in June, and then in July, and then when the grass went gold in September. I wasn't expecting that I'd get used to the sound of her moving around in the kitchen in the morning, that low particular efficiency of her, quiet and certain, the way she knew where everything was now because it was her kitchen as much as mine. I wasn't expecting that when she laughed, which wasn't often, but when she did it was real. I'd hear it from across the yard and feel something ease in my chest. I wasn't expecting her to see me. That's the thing. I'd been the man who kept the operation running and kept the peace and kept everyone else's problems from becoming catastrophes for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a person with his own weight to carry. Delia saw it. She didn't make a thing of it. She didn't sit me down and tell me she appreciated me. She just noticed things. The mornings when my hip was bad from an old break that never healed right, she didn't say anything. She just moved differently around the work so I didn't have to cover as much ground. When I came back from a hard day and didn't have words for it, she didn't fill the silence with talk. When Prout left in August for his sister's place in Colorado, and I took it harder than made sense. He was only a hired hand, but he'd been here 8 years, and 62 is old enough to feel the weight of people leaving. She noticed that too. She put a bottle of decent whiskey on the table that night and sat across from me and didn't say a word, and we had a drink and played cards until the lamp got low. I started to understand, somewhere in that fall, that what she was giving me wasn't gratitude. Gratitude runs out. What she was giving me was something she was choosing to give, freely, with her eyes open, to a man she'd watched operate under pressure for almost a year and had decided she wanted to be beside. That's a different thing altogether. That's the thing a man waits his whole life for and sometimes doesn't get once, let alone a second time. The second time Harlan Creel came to the ranch, it was October, a year and a half after the first. He came with 2 men this time, which I took as a sign of either less confidence or more intent, and I'd had enough warning from a man in town who I trusted that I had Cass on the roof again, and Delia inside with a loaded rifle and instructions to stay there. But what Harlan wanted this time wasn't a fight. He'd lost 3 small ranchers' contracts over the fall, men who decided that if Ren Ballard could stand up to Creel and keep his land, maybe they could renegotiate. He'd had a bad summer with stock, and his youngest brother, not Thomas, the other one, Warren, had left the operation after some dispute I didn't know the details of. He looked, when he rode in, like a man who'd had the wind taken out of him. Still hard, but less certain. He sat on his horse, and I stood in the yard and I waited. He said, "The 40 acres, the water right, I want to buy it from you." I said, "It's not for sale." He named a number, a good number. I said, "Still not for sale." He looked at the house. I didn't look at the house. I kept my eyes on him. He said, "There's no cause for us to keep being enemies." I said, "There's a woman in that house with your family's mark on her face. I'm going to need you to tell me what you figure ends that particular cause." He sat with that for a long moment. He said that was wrong. I didn't say anything. He said what was done to her was wrong. I'm saying it was. I still didn't say anything. He said, "Is there a number that?" I said no. He looked at the ground. He was a man who had not been told no many times in the last 20 years, and he was having to figure out what to do with it. I almost felt something about that. Not quite. He said, "All right, Ballard." He turned and rode back south, and his 2 men rode after him, and I watched them until the road was empty. Delia came out of the house while I was still watching the empty road. She came down the porch steps and across the yard and stood beside me, not touching, just there, both of us looking south at the dust settling. After a while she said, "He's not done." I said no. "But you're not either." I said no. She looked at the road, and then she looked at me, and something in her face was different than the measuring look. Open in a way I hadn't seen it, like a door that had been closed a long time swinging on a well-oiled hinge. She said, "I'm not going anywhere, Ren." I said, "I know." She reached out and found my hand and held it. Plain and simple. Her hand in mine at the edge of the yard with the dust settling on the south road and the cold coming off the north ridge and my land around us, fenced and worked in mine, hours as far as I could see. I'm not a man who has many words for the quiet things. I've worked most of my life in the language of what gets done, not what gets said. But standing there with her hand in mine, I thought about Alina, who I'd loved well for 19 years, and I thought about the 11 years after, alone in the house with the work and the cold and the long evenings. And I thought about a woman sitting in my South Creek with cattle dogs at her heels and her face turned away, and something in me that had gone flat and gray and adequate starting, without my permission, to come back. I thought about a man who locks the world out thinking he's protecting himself, and what it costs him, year by year, without his even noticing the cost. I held her hand. The ridge went orange and then red, and then the first pale stars came up over the east pasture, and the horses moved in the barn, and somewhere a long way south 3 heeler dogs were working cattle that weren't mine and never would be. I was fine with that. I was, for the first time in a long time, genuinely fine.